Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll finish up our discussion of Henry IV Part 1, which culminates in the Battle of Shrewsbury, which was in 1403. And we begin Act 4 with a glimpse into the camp of the rebels, and we see right away that there are issues. For one, there is division amongst their leaders. Hotspur and Douglas, who remember is from Scotland, are fierce, battle-hungry warriors who want to give battle to the king right away. And the more moderate voices, such as Worcester and Vernon, are trying to hold them back. They're saying, well, some of our troops have just arrived, the soldiers and the horses are exhausted from traveling, and they need at least the night to recuperate, so let's hold off the battle till morning at the very least. But Hotspur and Douglas both have very similar personalities and very similar notions of bravery, and they're bringing out the worst in each other in terms of recklessness. Remember that Douglas was the one-time enemy of Hotspur at the beginning of this play. They fought in single combat together for over an hour, if reports can be believed, and Hotspur has now turned him into an ally. So they have this mutual respect for each other. They see each other as these great warriors, and they're trying to essentially one-up each other in terms of bravery and honor. And as the generals are having this debate, bad news starts to come in. Owen Glendower, with his Welsh troops, apparently isn't coming. We learn a little bit later that he was overruled by prophecies that foretold a bad ending to the campaign. And this was probably true. Remember that Glendower is a superstitious man and someone who fancies himself a magician, and so he takes signs and prophecies really seriously. And he listens to them when they say, hey, this is an ill-fated venture, stay out of it. And just like that, a major portion of the rebels' army is gone. Then they learn that Hotspur's father, Northumberland, also isn't going to be able to make it. Reports say that he's become sick, and so he's confined to his bedchamber back at home. Hotspur and Douglas are okay with all this bad news because it means more glory for them. But Worcester, who's been around for a while and he's seen a thing or two, he knows that this is a bad sign. The commoners will think that Northumberland has stayed at home because he's afraid, or because he doesn't think that their cause is just. And then they'll take it as a sign of division in the ranks of the rebels. And public opinion is important, as King Henry was telling Prince Hal last week. And we'll learn in the next play, in fact, that Northumberland wasn't sick, or at least he wasn't all that sick. He's just not a very reliable person. And he wasn't back in Richard II either, so he's true to character. So there is disunity plaguing the rebels' camp. But King Henry's army has some problems of its own. In the next scene of Act 4, we see that Falstaff has scraped together the most pitiable, beggarly, and weak people in the land to fill up the numbers of the king's army. And this is something that he actually does in the next play as well. And it's reflective of a real crooked practice that went on even in Shakespeare's time. What would happen was that an edict would go out for the citizens to be conscripted into the army during times of war, and the officers in charge of rounding them up, like Falstaff here, would let the wealthier citizens pay their way out of the service. So they would give a bribe and stay home, and the officer would just move on to the next door. But then, pocketing the money and still needing to make up for the numbers, the officers in charge of collecting soldiers would go to the local jails or almshouses and force prisoners and beggars into the ranks instead. And it's safe to assume that Falstaff probably wouldn't have been the only one committing this fraud. It was common enough at the time. So we see King Henry's army might not be as loyal to him as he would wish either, because what's a beggar or a criminal really going to do on the battlefield? their bodies to put there, but we can't really depend on them for loyalty. We can't depend on them for bravery or cleverness. It's basically just a fake army or a useless army. Now, before the two sides are joined in battle here, we can see throughout Acts 4 and Act 5 that there are several different philosophies or principles guiding our cast of characters. And I want to take a moment to highlight each of them before we talk about the battle, because it's these principles that determine how they behave when it comes to the battle. And the first philosophy is that espoused by the younger generation. Hotspur, Hal, and even Douglas, they speak of honor, of virtue, and martial strength. And even John of Lancaster, who is Hal's younger brother, and he hasn't really had a role to play until now, he shows up in these scenes, and he's eager for glory and for battle, to the point where even Hal and the king are surprised. But Hotspur, I think more than all of them, really embodies this idea when he tells all of his men to die merrily. And then, just before battle, he gives them this speech. He says, "O gentlemen, the time of life is short. To spend that shortness basely were too long if life did ride upon a dial's point, still ending at the arrival of an hour. And if we live to tread on kings. If die, brave death when princes die with us. Now for our consciences, the arms are fair when the intent of bearing them is just." So this is an all-or-nothing attitude. What's life worth living if we don't accomplish heroic deeds with our time here on earth, is basically what he's saying. And it also goes back to the recurring concern with the concept of time that we see in these plays, and the virtue that lies in spending time well. For all of his faults, Hotspur isn't wasting his time like King Richard, or even like Hal has been doing. He says if we were to spend our time basely, that is, wrongly or lowly, we've lived too long even if we only lived for the span of an hour. Even an hour's worth of life isn't worth living if you're not doing something honorable with it. And for once, it seems like Hal is on board with this as well. We might say that he's finally acting not like Hal, but like Prince Henry, the Prince of Wales, that he's supposed to be. He challenges Hotspur to settle the issue over single combat, to spare the lives of all of the men, and to give him the chance to prove his honor to his father. But this doesn't happen, however, due to the manipulations of Worcester and Vernon, which brings me to the second philosophy that we see at play here, that of victory through cunning, through subtlety and deception. And this philosophy espouses that the results are what's important. Who cares how you win as long as you do win? And Worcester sees the world this way. It's why he lies to his nephew about the king's offer of peace. He knows that any such peace won't really last, not now, and for his own safety, he does what he thinks he has to do. He forces the issue right away. And King Henry thinks this way as well, which shouldn't come as a surprise to us if we remember how he acted back in Richard II. We see that he has several of his soldiers dressed up in his own clothes on the battlefield, decoy kings. Now this might be a good stratagem, but it's a far cry from the sort of honorable, chivalrous battle that Hotspur desires, or that Hal desires. Some might call it cowardly. It's painting a target, after all, on the backs of these other men. But it works, and it protects the king, and that's what's important. And finally, we see the philosophy of those who aren't concerned with winning at all. They just want to stay alive. And this is the philosophy of hedonism and materialism, only caring about your own fleshly comforts. And of course, as we might have expected, this is exemplified in Falstaff. Just before battle, he gives a soliloquy about the idea of honor and whether it's worth dying for after all. And it flies in the face of a lot of what Hotspur believes and a lot of what we're seeing that Hal believes. And so Falstaff says this: "Honor pricks me on. Yea, but how if honor prick me off when I come on? How then? Can honor set to a leg? No. Or an arm? No. Or take away the grief of a wound? No. Honor hath no skill in surgery then? No. What is honor? A word. What is in that word, honor? What is that honor? Air, a trim reckoning. Who hath it? He that died a Wednesday. Doth he feel it? No. Doth he hear it? No. 'Tis insensible then? Yea, to the dead. But will it not live with the living? No. Why? Detraction will not suffer it. Therefore, I'll none of it. Honor is a mere scutcheon." And so ends my catechism. So, not only is this a materialistic perspective, it's also a nihilistic perspective. It's denying the existence of transcendent truths and concepts such as honor, bravery, and virtue. He doesn't believe in any of that. He just wants to live. And if ideas like honor and bravery and virtue can't provide any immediate material benefit, such as fixing a broken arm or a leg or tending to the wounded in surgery as he describes, then he sees it as something that's pretty pointless. And so again, I highlight these philosophies because they determine how the men who hold them behave. Once battle begins, things fall out predictably. Falstaff lays on the ground and pretends to be dead. King Henry is always protected, either by his decoys or by his sons, and the heroes are sweeping the battlefield. Douglas and Hotspur on one side, and Hal and John of Lancaster on the other. Then we finally have the meeting of the two Henrys, or the two Harrys, which is this exciting climactic moment. We've been following them all throughout the play, and then they finally come face to face. Now, at the actual Battle of Shrewsbury, historically, this fight didn't happen. Hotspur was actually killed by an arrow, and Hal was actually shot in the face with an arrow as well, a wound that almost killed him, and it disfigured him for life too. If you look at contemporary portraits of Hal, who later on becomes King Henry V, you'll see that some of the more famous ones always show him in profile, not looking straight at the viewer. And that's because one side of his face had this disfigurement from an arrow striking it. But, frankly, a disfigured prince and an enemy killed by some random archer doesn't make for a very good story. And so Shakespeare arranges for this meeting on the battlefield to take place. And they duel. And since we're reading a play, we have to imagine how long and how epic such a fight might last. The script usually just says they fight. But any stage performance or even movie performance can take liberty here to employ some good choreography and dramatic moments to really play this out. And in the end, Hal kills Hotspur. And with his dying breath, Hotspur admits that he's actually okay with dying, but it's the loss of his honor that really bothers him. And then, standing over his body, Hal makes this comment about ambition. He says, "Fare thee well, great heart. Ill-weaved ambition, how much art thou shrunk! When that this body did contain a spirit, a kingdom for it was too small a bound, but now 2 paces of the vilest earth is room enough. This earth that bears thee dead bears not alive so stout a gentleman." So, Richard, in the last play, made a similar comment about how even when someone as great and important as a king is buried, they still only possess the same small plot of land as any other corpse would. It's a bit of a pragmatic look at the idea of pride and how ultimately futile it is to strive to gain so much when, in the end, you can't take it with you. And this is an old idea in literature, going back even to Odysseus' encounter with Achilles in Hades in the Odyssey. We see Achilles lamenting the fact that he's dead, and that he'd rather be an unknown servant who is still alive as opposed to a renowned hero and a king who has lost his life. Anyway, then Hal sees Falstaff down as well, and he gives a eulogy that's a strange blend of sincere regret for his passing and also mockery. He seems genuinely sad that his friend is dead, but he's still making jokes about his weight as he laments the fact. It's kind of touching, I guess, in a way. That's just the relationship that they have with each other. But after Hal walks off stage, Falstaff sits back up. And then he gets the idea that if he laid down and pretended to be dead, then who's to say that Hotspur didn't do the same thing? So he stabs Hotspur's corpse with his sword, and when Hal and the others come back, he tells another wild story about how they both got up from the ground at the same moment and fought for over an hour before he was able to kill Percy himself. It's the Gad's Hill story all over again. And Hal, for his part, decides that it isn't worth arguing over. And it's kind of strange, because he's relinquishing all of the honor that he's just won by allowing Falstaff to get away with this lie. And so we can speculate as to why he goes along with this. Maybe he figures that he's won enough honor by his other deeds on the battlefield. I don't know. And it even shows a kind of grace in him, right? That he would allow someone else to take the credit for what he did. But either way, remember that in terms of posterity, it doesn't really matter. Neither one of them actually killed Hotspur. It was a random archer. So this play ends with a major victory for King Henry and for his sons. But the war isn't over. There's still Glendower, there's still Mortimer, and Northumberland to deal with. As well as the Archbishop of York, who is this other figure that we hear mentioned briefly, but he doesn't really appear that much on stage in this play. But with all that being said, the main portion of the rebels' army and its most prominent figure, its most prominent hero, Hotspur, is dealt with. Many saw Henry Percy's death as the end of the matter, because he was regarded as such a competent warrior and a competent leader. And as a matter of fact, here's another fun but also kind of gross historical tidbit. Rumors circulated for some time that Hotspur wasn't really dead, and so his body had to be exhumed and put on display just so people could see that he really had been killed. I guess that's one way to quash a rumor, right? So that'll be it for Henry IV Part 1. It's probably one of my favorite of the plays that we'll be reading this year. I think Richard II was probably my favorite. But this is a great play. It's a coming-of-age story with a cast of many colorful characters, which Richard II kind of lacked. In that play, the only characters that were really worth looking into were the king himself and Henry Bolingbroke. Here, we have all sorts of interesting character studies that we could make. So for the next lecture, read Act 1 of Henry IV Part 2, and we'll see what things look like in the aftermath of the Battle of Shrewsbury.